The topic for tonight is how can we provide space for all students? Our first speaker will be John Milliken, Chairman of the Community Facilities Study Committee.
Thank you. I appreciate the chance to come back before the Committee of 100 and talk a little bit about the Community Facilities Study, which when people ask me what it is, I say that it's a group appointed jointly by the county board and the school board to look at Arlington's financial resources and, given its demographic trends, its longer-term facility needs, and in some ways see how well they match up and identify challenges that the county needs to address over the course of the next stretch of years. In some ways, it's a kind of strategic planning process. It's not a grand strategic plan. It's focused on facilities, but in the course of it, the 23 of us that that make up this committee, let me see if I can figure out how to make this a full page here. Thank you. That should be right down there somewhere. Okay, good. A 23-member commission, and importantly supported by something called the Resident Forum. And the Resident Forum is now well over 100 individuals who have either been designated by organizations, PTAs, civic associations, nonprofit groups, or self-designated that wanted to be active participants in this discussion. And we began this exercise in February. Here's really a summary of what we've been charged with doing. Look at future revenue projections for the county, look at current and future demographics for the county, identify public facility needs going forward, try to develop a process and a set of criteria to guide the county board and the school board in deciding what goes in a given place and how they go about deciding what that is and where it should go. And as I say, identify as we go through this process some of the principal challenges that we believe that the county faces going forward. Here's been our schedule. I won't dwell on this, but we're roughly halfway. And we've been mostly gathering information to this point. 23 very knowledgeable people, but not all with the same base of information across the spectrum. Some came more from a school's background and knew a little less about county activities. Some came more from a county background and knew less about school activities. So to bring everybody up to the same knowledge base, this has been our schedule. Our reports are due, an initial report on particular items in September and a final report in November. What have we learned? Here are the three topics I want to talk about tonight. We've talked about county finances, where we get our money, topic number one. We've talked about demographics. Who are we and what do we think is going to be the demographic profile for the county 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And given those demographics, what do we think our longer-term facility needs are going to be? Starting with money. Logical place to start when you're talking about a need for long-term spending for facilities. You got to ask yourself, where's the money coming from? Here's the budget. Overall budget of about $1.1 billion for the county. Here's where we get it. Very important. Real estate, condominium taxes, residential real estate, meaning multifamily home meaning single-family homes and duplexes, real estate commercial, and real estate multifamily apartments. So you can see from that that a substantial percentage of our income for the county comes from the real estate tax. And of the real estate tax, 50% of that real estate tax comes from our commercial tax base. That's what makes the Arlington economic model different and unique, and for the last 40 years, a very positive one. How do we compare with some of our neighbors? We get 50%, we're the bottom line there. We get 50% of our real estate taxes from our commercial tax base. Fairfax County gets only 25% from its commercial tax base. Prince William County gets only 22% from its commercial tax base. What that means is that the single-family home residential and the condominium owners don't have to carry as large a share of the tax burden as they do in our neighboring jurisdictions. One of the challenges that we've identified is, though the commercial tax base has been a critical part of where we've gotten our money, we are facing a serious problem right now because of our office vacancy rate. All the stuff that's going on that you read about in the papers, the base relocation, and all of the problems that have led to a higher vacancy rate than we're accustomed to. What does that mean? Well, you can see from this that each 1% of occupancy, office occupancy, is worth about $3.4 million in taxes. So if you've got a 10% vacancy rate, 10% greater than is normally the case, you're costing yourself $34 million a year. Just some examples of what some of these buildings do contribute to the local tax base. Having talked about finances, we turned our attention to county demographics. This is just a profile of who we are. We're 216,000 people and relatively high income and a very high education attainment level, something to be proud of. This is how we have grown in the course of the years since I've been involved here, going back to 1950 when we were 135,000. We're now well up into the above 200. This is where we think we're going in overall population, from the 207 that the census said we were in 2010, projected to go up to over 280,000 in the next 30 years. Where are we? What groups are growing fastest? Well, you know, the one you hear most about are the millennials, and certainly they have been the fastest growing age group in Arlington now for the last decade. You can see that trajectory. But in addition to that, the others that are growing fast are the over 65. And when we think about facilities, we need to think about that age group and what its needs might be going forward. And of course, the other group that's going fast, the under 5. We are once again in Arlington going through a period where people are having kids and staying in Arlington, at least for the time being. We hope they continue to. What does that mean? Well, you ask yourself, what are the facility implications for this growth? This tries to break down by housing category where our students come from. And you can see that for the student generation factor, as they call it, says that for every single family home, we generate 0.42 students. In other words, every 2 homes, single family home in Arlington generates a student. Very different than apartments and condos. Single family homes remain the big student generator in Arlington County. You can see that summary here in 13-14. 55% of the student body came from single-family homes, the 28,000 or so single-family homes that make up Arlington County. Having talked about demographics, we turned our attention to our third principal information topic, which was land. How do we use our land in terms of public facilities? Well, you start from the proposition that we are a tiny community. We're 26 square miles, and of that 26 square miles, just a little over 2 is used by county and schools for public purposes. What's the rest of it used for? Well, 14.4 square miles is in private ownership. 3.5 belongs to either the federal or the state government, and 6 miles is made up of right-of-way, all of the roads and other public thoroughfares that crisscross the county. So that leaves only 2.2 square miles that are available currently for county facility use. This gives you an idea of where some of those facilities are, and I won't go into the detail. There are plenty of copies of this, by the way, on the front table for anybody who'd like to take one. Here are the issues that we're working on, thinking about in terms of facility needs going forward. Parking and maintenance for a growing school bus, so a growing number of school buses, a growing number of art buses, a growing number of other public vehicles that we need a place to keep them. You can't just they don't disappear at night when they're not in use, and they need to be maintained and cleaned. Fire stations. We know we're going to need another fire station to meet the response time that everybody expects from their fire department. We know we're going to need increased storage. As we grow, we're going to need a place to put stuff. So that's not the easiest thing to locate in any community. Parkland, obviously a precious resource in any community, particularly in a highly urbanized community like Arlington. I'll go back here for a second. You can see from the green sort of where the parks are, both Arlington and regional. And, you know, for any given neighborhood, the parks are an important part of their ambiance, of their living and existing as a neighborhood. So, as I say, we're about halfway through. This is where you can find out a lot more about what we're doing. And you're welcome to email us. You can, if you do such a thing, follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. I promise not to tweet. Don't do that. But I'd encourage you, if you have not been, to become active with the group. I'm actually playing hooky from one of our meetings tonight. The group is meeting at Washington and Lee in one of our regular group meetings talking about the siting of public facilities. Next steps. Next steps, now having gathered all of this information, is to begin to pull some of it together. What are the financial challenges that we face? What are the implications of the demographics that we project for the county? What kind of process do we want to recommend for the county and school boards for the siting of public facilities? As I say, our reports are due in September and November. It's been a interesting, challenging, and I hope very productive several months, and we've got several more months to go. And I really appreciate the chance to have come and shared these few thoughts with you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
So we're going to go through these questions or the information that was passed along and then be able to address that. So talking first about more seats at particular grade levels, and I think John's presentation kind of paralleled some of the things that we've seen happen here in Arlington in relationship now to the schools. You can see what happened coming out of the baby boom, and we were, back in the early 60s, over 25,000 students. We're getting very close to that, by the way, today. You can see then what happened in the 70s and the drop-off. You can also see then we begin in the 90s to increase, and there's an echo there with the baby boomers as far as increasing student population. And as we go out, today we're sitting just shy of 25,000. We're going to be looking at K-12 enrollment here. And first we're looking at just the enrollment trends with kindergarten. And you can see as those transition out from the last 10 years, what's happened in the increases as we go through. This trend, by the way, continues to demonstrate its way out. We've got another way of looking at this in relationship to graduation, and there's about an 800 student difference when we look at some of the exiting classes, which when I started back in 2009 were about a cohort of 1,200, and we've got cohorts of kindergartners who are entering around 2,200. So you look at the span of that difference and you can get a real sense. The other piece of that is you often hear about the projections and the reliability of those projections, and I think one of the things that I want to share with you with the presentation this evening is these students are here. These aren't projections. They're in the pipeline and they're beginning to come through at the elementary level. We can look here at just the K-12 enrollment, and again you get a sense or a picture of how these things begin to shape out. Now I did cite a number for you, and I just want to make note of it. I mentioned that we're, I believe today, at 24,500 plus students. This data here does not include our pre-K students, and they are slightly over 1,000 students. So you add 1,000 to this number here, and you get close to the 24,500. Same thing here when we're looking at the elementary enrollment and what's transpired. Again, the picture is very similar. We look at the middle school enrollment. It's not as dramatic, but you get to see the sense of how enrollment is increasing. Most significantly, the elementary, because those students are beginning to enter into the system. And then the same picture here with the high school and the increases there. Again, less dramatic than the middle and the elementary, but again, the picture is that we're seeing increases and those students are continuing to move through the system. So now we're going to look at projections, and again, we're just looking at K through 12. And so you can see as we go out, I've been saying at 2020 we're going to just be shy of 30,000 students, and that based on our projections and where we are today, that's still pretty much holds true. And so you get a sense of what's going to continue to happen. I'm going to look at this, and as John mentioned, we've brought these materials, and you may want to pick this up. Again, the way that we've arrayed this is by quadrants, and so you can see in the northeast quadrant, we've got Jamestown, Taylor, Arlington Science Focus Key, and Long Branch sits there on the edge. You can pick this up, but I think what I want to give you basically is kind of a concept of what's happening in relationship to these enrollments. And the key here is that if it's flagged green, we're within capacity. If it's flagged yellow, higher than capacity but within 10%. And then if it's in red, it's more than 10% above capacity. So if we project out to 2019, also based on the projects that we have currently in the pipeline with our CIP, you can still see that we're facing many challenges either within the 10% of capacity or in fact within some of those quadrants above, and total elementary is we're above that 10% capacity. When you see now, I'm flipping back to 2015 and where we stand now, you can see based on what our capacity is and what our projections are, you can see that we're still within that 10%. So again, we're projecting forward and we're going to see those increases coming. The following slides kind of array in the same manner. These are our middle schools here. When we look at projecting out with the to September 2019, again, we're going to be above the 10% of capacity. You can see the increase there, or within 10% of capacity. And then where we sit today, also we're within. So the middle school issue is not as dramatic as the elementary. And then when we look at our high school programs, You can see here where we project out to 2019. Again, it's above the 10% capacity. And then where we sit today with September 2015, we're within the 10%. So what are some of the past actions that we've taken, or what are some of the steps that we are looking at? Well, we've got new construction. We've also renovated a number of buildings. We've also added a number of additions to some of our operating schools, and I'll show you those, or I'll talk with you about those here. We've also taken under our strategies is our progressive planning model, and that's been arrayed across a variety of things that we've progressively changed. Previously, we had standalone computer labs. Well, technology has changed. It's no longer necessary, so we've recaptured some of that space. We have raised class size twice, one time at all grade levels and another time just at the high schools. You've seen that we've added a number of relocatables, and one of the things that I encourage folks to do is to drive around the county and see where those relocatables are. John yielded time to me, so I can have a few more minutes. And so you get a sense also of some of the things that have taken place, as well as implementing boundary changes. I want to make you aware with whatever changes we attempt or move forward with, there are going to have to be associated boundary changes that are going to take place as well once those decisions are made. Here's the new Discovery School that's slated to open this September. And so that was a step here to address some of the capacity concerns we have in the northern part of Arlington with our elementary schools, in this case, adding 630 seats. At Washington Lee, as well as in other projects, we're going to look at modifying or recapturing some of the space, how it was originally designed when the buildings were constructed and how it's being utilized today. We realize that we can capture close to 300 seats. It's also changing the culture of how teachers work together and students work. And so this chart is of, or this diagram here is of Washington Lee, and those areas that are either in purple and the tan are areas where we're going to recapture and add additional seats. We are in the process of doing a renovation underway at McKinley, coupled with adding additional seats with an addition. The same thing is true with Abington, with some renovation to that facility, as well as an addition that will add 136 seats. With the change with the program of HB Woodlawn and the Stratford program, moving to the new facility on Wilson Boulevard, or the new site there, and changing the Stratford building there to a middle school site, we will see that we will have an additional 1,000 seats. That will very much accommodate some of the growth that you're seeing at the middle school level. And then the HB Woodlawn program moving to the Wilson School site along with the Stratford program, capturing an additional 775 seats. So what does this tell us, and what do we need to do as far as actions that need to take place? Again, you can see based on what our capacity and what the projected enrollment is and what the status would be, we're going to have to begin to take some types of actions, most significantly at the elementary level at this point in time. With the addition of the Stratford and Wilson's moves, we can see that we are going to be able to recapture seats and also continue to address many of these issues with relocatables. So recently I updated the board as of April 30th, which was an update as far as where we are and what we need to do. And one of the issues is looking at a new neighborhood elementary school in South Arlington. The board right now is in the process of a discussion about what that community engagement will look like, and very shortly going to be coming out, working very closely with the county in how we move forward, but looking at potential sites, revisiting the Jefferson facility as a possible site, and hearing from the county board as far as responding to some of their questions. Also, identifying some Arlington Public School sites and possibly county-owned sites. As I mentioned, future boundary considerations need to be part of that. And then we're on a timeline to be able to open that new elementary school by 2019. If we're able to meet that timeline, that's the optimal objective. If we're not, we could possibly looking at 2020. But those things need to continue to play themselves out. Just some other things that I want to make folks mindful of that I know are part of a conversation that we often hear. I know our neighbors in Fairfax County recently acquired a facility over in Bailey's Crossroads that they were able to turn into an upper elementary facility. While we continue to look at some of those options for consideration, there are certain things that we need to factor in, and part of that is access, code requirements, also gymnasium space. And then the other piece is our capital is paid through bond funding, whereas if we were to lease space, we'd have to include that as part of our annual operating. So it's just a different funding mechanism that we need to recognize how that will play itself out. Finally, I also know there's been a lot of discussion in relationship to how enrollment is calculated and also how the county calculates or forecasts population. I know John's committee has worked very closely at this. We've also had some analysis done on this, and the feedback that we are receiving is both processes are very reliable and consistent, and the things that they're looking at indicate what that either growth with our total population or school projections are right on. The difference is we look at different variables or different factors to calculate, and the processes are not parallel, basically. So oftentimes when you hear that, I think being able to address it in this way and say, both processes are solid, but they look at different factors, gives us the confidence that the numbers that we are generating are good numbers.
Our third speaker tonight will be Ted Hayes, who is president of the Arlington County Council of PTAs.
So I was asked to come on out and talk about PTA perspective on this issue of space and utilization and things like that. And John has talked about the county-wide perspective and the mechanism involved to look at space and utilization versus parks and things like that. Dr. Murphy's talked about the planning that goes into this and the planning factors and looking at some of those diagrams. And I'm not going to show you figures and things like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the PTAs look at this and how what we think is important and how that relates to some of these issues here. So let me just ask you, as part of the audience participation feature this evening, how many of you have a child or a grandchild or a nephew or niece or something like that in the school system? All right, good. So many of you do, if not most of you. That's really good. Now, of course, remember, I'm coming from the PTA perspective. How many of you looked at that building that your child or your niece or your grandson or granddaughter went to and said, gosh, I wish that place were bigger? Okay, how many of you look at that building and say, gosh, I wish this place was better. I want to make it better. Okay, come on, a couple of you. Thanks a lot. You're going to burst my... Okay, good, thanks. So let's say it's a wash. How about making it bigger and better? That's what we really want, right? Okay, good. All right, so I want to talk about what we do at County Council of PTAs and how that relates to this particular issue. County Council of PTAs is the organizing group for all the PTAs in each one of the schools. So they come to us and we provide them with resources and we coordinate their activities, and we have great speakers come on in and they talk to us about what they're doing, and it's a way to share information and build community. That's what we're all about, building community and building engagement. Now everybody knows that the county can't just, all of us in PTAs, so I'll forward it that way. All of us know that the county can't just raise taxes to a level to build as many school buildings as needed as quickly as possible. You just can't do that, right? PTAs are communities of parents and teachers and staff who have to deal with the reality of kids learning every day in every building. The reality is that kids need space. They need services, right? Gifted and talented students, special ed students, ESOL, HILT, everything in between. They need great teachers. They need security. They need a strong curriculum. And that all requires highly competent management and leadership. So that's what we're focused on, is getting that type of management and leadership into the school system. The result of having that great management and leadership is having wise thoughts about space and spatialization. And I'll come back to that. Arlington, much like other communities with well-educated, high-power, job-holding residents, has an abundance of parents and grandparents who have great ideas about what's to be expected. And John talked about expectations. And they want to be heeded, and that's the Arlington way, right? That's why we have forums like this. So the PTAs are focused on 3 outcomes related to the Arlington way in terms of school space issues. First is managing the daily reality of the school itself. Getting involved inside the school with school functions and programs as partners to teachers and principals and crossing guards and security resource officers and coaches. The daily reality is that some children are not achieving at the same rate as others, and some opportunities are available to some but not others. And that's a problem regardless of how much space is available, right? So we care about that. We care about student achievement. Second is encouraging people to get involved on beyond PTA committees, and there are a whole bunch of them. Budget, facilities, instruction, master planning, the Joint County APS Planning Committee. To digital citizenship, that was last night, to envision what is needed beyond or in addition to physical plan. For example, you say you want APS to provide 21st century education using STEM, science, technology, education, math, or the new thing, STEAM, science, technology, education, and arts and math. And technology. What is the role of the Career Center in that? How about internships? How about distance learning? How about partnerships with Northern Virginia community colleges? How about renting out parts of George Mason and Marymount or the Artisphere? What about all that space left over from BRAC and busing kids there? Is that something you want to do? There's a lot of space. We want to bus kids there? What happens if we build it and they don't keep coming? Right? So it's the opposite of the Field of Dreams issue. Of course, the unofficial motto of APS is you make them, we take them. But, you know, at some point, John was talking about it, keeping those millennials here, and that's what's generating all those kids in schools. How can the public use the space when class is not in session? If you didn't know, the public can use space when class is not in session. Some space, the outdoor space. These are questions that committees and PTAs discuss and vet for review by staff and the school board. Third is engaging with the APS school board and staff, such as Dr. Murphy and John Chadwick and Lionel White, to provide input and feedback on how the vision of each committee is playing out relative to how crowding is affecting education. You may recall the proposed boundary change process about 8 years ago. It's before Dr. Murphy came here. I think you could best describe that as barely controlled. It was not well handled. But it's gotten better. It does take time, but it has gotten better. We build trust and mutual respect with APS and its staff and the school board to make change happen. That's what we do. So do we need more space? Sure we do. There are a couple of schools that are just bursting with students and they need attention. But space is just a tool, like iPads and books and smart boards and 3D printers and those little, everything else that they use, little smartphones and things like that. It's a tool. Space is a tool. So think about space as a tool. How can you use space better? Education happens both inside and outside building space, and that is our concern. So with that, thank you very much.
And now I'd like to ask our 3 speakers to come up and get at the table up front. We'll enter into the traditional question and answer session.
And as recently as just 10 years ago, I can recall when the concept of the average size, the ideal size of, say, a middle school ought to be 600, sort of these national guidelines. So I'm just wondering, are those standards just totally rendered obsolete by the current crowding conundrum?
Are we looking at constructing schools differently than we did on 20-acre sites where we may have had 1 story or 2 stories? And the answer to that is yes, we are. And I think you'll see that play out. We're in the process of designing the site at Wilson, and that's going to be a site that I think is going to have a variety of different levels to it, and also how it fits in on the streetscape there is going to be somewhat unique. I think also you're saying, okay, what is the preference as far as the size of its schools? And I know when I first came here, which is only going back to 2009, Ashlawn Elementary was less than 400 students. And that school has just received an addition and is going to be well over 600 students. So I think some of that is driven by school board policy. It's also driven by the community and what their desire and preference is. But I also think you have to look at the quality of the educational program, and it's been a priority, I think, of the school board as well as the community to have small schools. And I think that's reflected also in the quality of education that we offer and also in the performance in our schools, which I think we're very proud of.
How can we be outside of the box doing things differently? You alluded to building schools up instead of out, but how else can we make creative changes?
I'll give you two examples that I think kind of ring true to what you're saying. The first is, one of my advocacy points is around technology and how we utilize technology. There's a variety of things that offers. Number one, it changes the game in providing kids opportunities and access. It also changes the game as far as going 24/7 as opposed to the typical clock of 9 to 3 or 8 to 2. So I think that's something that we're seeing in our community and in our life that is going to continue to gain momentum, and I think we need to be prepared for that. It's also something we need to prepare our students for as far as when they enter the workforce. You know, I saw something the other day. The top skills back in the 70s, the top 3 skills were reading, writing, and computation. Those are still skills that our employees are looking for, but guess what the top 3 are today? Collaboration, engagement, and creativity. So the things that our employers are looking for, we need to begin to integrate into what our schools are doing. Another more concrete example is at Washington Lee. One of the things that they're looking at, and some of our other comprehensive high schools are looking at, for this coming year, if you are a senior and you're on target to graduate, you can reduce your class schedule. If you're an athlete, you may want to arrive at school after school has started in the second block and then go through the rest of the day. If you have to go out on work study or you want to take advantage of maybe going to community college, all you need to do is maybe take 5 courses. You've already satisfied your graduation requirement, and that's beginning to free up space. So there are these small adjustments that we're looking at that I think serve us, but ultimately at the end of the day serve kids in how they utilize their time. And it's a bridge, it's beginning that bridging process for many of our graduates as they move on to post-secondary or to jobs.
Hi, I'm Richard Barton. I was on the school board in 1980 when we were going down, down, down. And our whole problem then was what schools were we going to close and what were we going to do with them. And now it's changed. You've been commenting on this, but as we were looking at the good bit of leased office space that is empty, we had a building, the DARPA building, right across from us. And our concept, my wife was also in the school system, was that you could be able to use office building space for great schools. It's just going to be up higher. And I know that you've all talked about this, but just comment a little bit more on that.
I'll use this as the backdrop, and I only know what I know about it from reading the newspaper and hearing it like you do secondhand. I think the scenario in Fairfax played itself out very nicely because that situation was a foreclosure, and the economic conditions around that were very advantageous. So number one, they were able to take advantage of that, and they made that work in their budget. I think we need to recognize the increases in the operating the annual operating costs if we were to look at a lease. While we have looked initially at the open inventory of vacancies, none of the buildings that currently are open or vacant present to us with the opportunity where we would want to pursue them. So I think we have done an initial scan or an initial review of some of the buildings that may be coming available, and we'll continue to really look at that. But I think there are certain code requirements that we need to look at, and also other considerations in relationship to looking at those spaces. Those spaces may work for us better at the high school level, but right now one of the concerns that we have, and my charts kind of demonstrated that, is at the elementary level, and it's a little bit more of a challenge for elementary students to get them into those kind of spaces.
I'll comment only indirectly by saying that perhaps the single most clearest lesson that we have taken to heart in the Facilities Committee in the first half of our review is that Arlington's most precious resource is land. Yes, we all worry about budgets, tax levels, and all those things need to be looked at closely and carefully, but the single scarcest, most important resource in the community is land area. How we use it, are we using it effectively and efficiently and in ways that redound to the benefit of the surrounding neighborhoods, is perhaps the most important question. So Richard's question that says, are there other more creative ways to use some of this space that is now not being occupied by tenants in office buildings? Schools are a possibility. I defer to the superintendent on what's appropriate for a school, but there are other things as well that might be thought of as possible public uses of some of those spaces.
The issues around the security for students are going to be most important for PTAs to start with, because we need students they can't really learn if they're not safe in a particular place. So we start with that. And then there is an issue of what do you use the space for? And as I said before, our concern is that space is a tool, just like a computer or a smart board or something like that. So what is the purpose of this space, and what use is it best put to? I think just renting out a big hall at George Mason or here at Marymount would certainly create space, but it's not necessarily space that's best suited for a pedagogical purpose. So we'd like the school systems to think about how could we get kids out of a particular space so we have other kids in there, and give them something useful to do so that they're learning something. So it could be technology, it could be taking a course at home, could be having an extension experience at Nova. Might be easier at the high school level, but then maybe there's some middle school opportunities too. So our concerns, first of all, is that the children are safe, and secondly, that there is a wise use of space, just like a tool, so that we can have extra opportunities. John talked about expectations, to get the most education into students in the time that we have available to educate them.
It strikes me that your analysis will be incomplete if we don't know about whether there are going to be any significant developments by income level of the students and of the community, as well as ethnic composition. And because each of those demographic figures has those subdivisions lying beneath it that could affect our planning very greatly.
Mike, I agree with that entirely, and I simply didn't go into it tonight. But as you look at the county and try to figure out what its needs are going to be, you need to look behind the numbers. Who are these people? Just to pick probably the single most dramatic question that hangs over things that we don't really have an answer to is, what about this millennial population? Are they going to stay in significant number and raise kids here? Are they going to be able to find housing that they can afford in order to do so? Or are they more likely to be in large numbers as their parents and grandparents were and move out to Centerville or the next decade's equivalent of Centerville. We don't know that. We're beginning to get some anecdotal evidence that a larger proportion of that population is going to stay, but it's anecdotal at best. But that question, which hangs over the schools population and other, has lots of implications for future facility needs, is one that we've got to ponder and look at, but we're probably not going to have a crisp answer for.
I would like to ask the superintendent, in his projections about meeting capacity, are there any plans to then reduce class size along with increasing that capacity? One child more in a classroom doesn't seem like much, but it's a lot, because its numbers creep.
I think one of the things we need to be mindful of first is when you see the reporting of class size, you're looking at the average. So the average kind of just gives you a midpoint. There are ranges to that, and actually, if you, I believe if you go on our website, you can see a sense of what some of those ranges look like. As we continue to grow, I think the way we've been able to address some of the increasing capacity is through relocatables as a step or a measure. That's a temporary step, but it's also served us very well in that it's got a strong kind of economic structure to it. The classrooms are very attractive and students enjoy them, as well as many teachers actually prefer to move out to them. So that's a step that we've used. We've actually got 125 of those scattered throughout Arlington Public Schools, but that can't be our sole solution. I think the other issue that we're very mindful of is how we utilize tax dollars, and we don't want to overbuild. So there needs to be a balance as far as what that future holds for us. Ideally, I would like to see us stay where we are currently with our class sizes. I know your belief may be that we need to look at reducing those class sizes. But let me give you just a quick snapshot of this year's budget. With the increase in student population that we realized last year, which was over 5% in the history of Arlington Public Schools, that's the largest increase that we've seen since keeping track of those records. By the way, that's at all levels, elementary, middle, and high. It's just not solely at one level. We had to identify an additional increase to our budget of $14 million. So how we look at that and sustain that's going to continue to be an increasing pressure for us. And it's also something that we need to look at in how we maintain the quality of our instructional program. So it's going to continue to be a balancing act.
The county board just recently bought a big piece of property off of Quincy Avenue, and what's the likelihood that that would be used to build a school?
We are in conversation with the county about that, and so I think though, and I might even feel more comfortable in having, since we do have two county board members here, and my knowledge of this is again the newspaper, pretty much predominantly, but I think I'd almost prefer for them to provide the best information.
Ms. Hines, would you like to address this?
So we are excited that we have this option agreement with Mr. Buck to buy what is 6 acres of property right off Quincy Street across from the Ed Center. We will not fully exercise that option until 2017. It's a $30 million purchase, and we need to put the money together to do that. The land is the only industrial land north of Route 50 in the whole county. So the things that you can do by right there are things like bus storage and vehicle storage and other kinds of things. Don't need any use permits, etc. But we all know that there's 4 things that we're working toward in this community: more schools, more parks, more affordable housing, and then solving some of our storage issues. So in my mind, and of course I won't be sitting there making these decisions, but some other people will, The process that John's group is working on, we've asked them to come up with criteria and process that we can use to help make these kinds of decisions for our community. And so it seems to me that this parcel is a very good parcel on which we should use potentially, John shaking his head no, but I think there'll have to be a community process. Fundamentally, that's the issue. And we're going to have to look at what the pressing needs are and how to best accommodate them in this parcel, potentially along with you all may be aware that the hospital has come in and indicated that they're interested in the county parcel next door, and they have land that they would be willing to put on the table for a swap. Or potentially cash. I mean, we are going to be in conversations with them over the course of this year as well. So we have a couple parcels in play that potentially help us in strategic locations do things that meet strategic needs.
Those two actions, one taken and one kind of in process, for the county to gain control over significant parcels of property are extraordinarily important for the long-term future of public uses of places in Arlington County. As I'm back to the issue of the single scarcest, most important resource in the community is space. 6 acres is a remarkable size parcel for a county that's only 26 square miles. So if I had a hat, it would be off to the county board for taking the step.
We need your help. We've put out a report today. It doesn't reflect the views of the Civic Federation, but some of us on the Schools Committee are very concerned because we believe that the projections for students in the next 10 years are going to be much greater than has been shared with tonight. And we project probably that we see elementary school deficit in 2024 of 5,100 to 7,500 seats. At the middle school level, 1,000 to 1,800, and the high school, 2,000 to 3,000. We think we're facing a very difficult situation. We have some of our reports here, executive summary of the reports up here on the table, and they'll be on the CivFed website in a week. The question here is, how do we begin a discussion about how to develop new revenue streams for the school seats? How do we talk about developer contributions? How do we talk about popping the 10% debt cap? How do we talk about having the county defer its very much needed capital investments? How do we look at public-private partnerships? We think that we need to begin a community conversation about some of these sacred cows to try to get a handle on this, because we don't think bond funds are enough in the current planning.
First, I look forward to looking at the study, and I'm glad it's out in time for us to include it in our thinking. As the superintendent said, we spent a lot of time in the committee looking at how the schools and how the county project population for their respective needs. They have different needs so that they look at different things, and we brought in some outside experts from who do these kinds of studies nationally for them to do a critique of the way we look at and gather our data. Their report to us said first that we are doing it in a valid, statistically sound way on both the county and the school side, and that historically, at least, we've had very good track record. In fact, we've had a little kerfluffle recently between the county and the Census Bureau. Census Bureau says one thing for its mid-decade projection for county population. Arlington thinks differently. Well, historically, Arlington's much more accurate in knowing what Arlington's growth rates are going to be than is the Census Bureau between actual counts. Sure, we'll rely on what they count in 2020, but right now we have a better idea of what our population is than the Census Bureau does. school population projections have historically been pretty good. There are a couple of very significant uncertainties about future population. The millennials, one that I described a few moments ago, is certainly one of them. What are those folks going to do, and how many of them are going to do it? Are they going to stay as many of them say they're going to, or are they going to be like many of their parents were and many of their grandparents were and move to larger places where housing is less expensive? We don't know. We don't know the answer to that question.
I appreciate, Michael, your comments, and you are a strong school advocate in the work of the Civ Fed. I'm going to look forward to reading the information in the report that's coming out. I think going back, I fondly remember coming in 2009 and working with Meg Tasillo at the time, and there was a lot of concern about projections at that point in time. And I said, hey, let's not get into a debate about this. Let's just bring in a consultant and let's have someone outside. And they validated what we were doing. They made some suggestions about how we could address some issues with our projections, but they said what we were doing and how we were calculating was a solid process. I think one of the things we continue to wrestle with is new students, specifically at the kindergarten level, entering the school division, and that continues to be one of our challenges, and I know Mr. White may allude to that. The other piece is, and I think we got sidetracked on this, and I do want to make mention of it, the county has been working very closely with us as we look at what I'm constituting as interim solutions before we can bring any of these projects that are not online currently with our current CIP in 2019. And so there have been a number of spaces that have actually been offered and that we're looking at as possible interim sites, or how we can use those facilities as far as down at the Carver Center and Drew Model and over at the Fenwick facility. So those are helping with our inventory, and I see that as a good collaboration and good way for us to better utilize all the facilities that we have within the county. I appreciate your response, Mary, and I think the fact that the county is seeking an option is a good sign and a positive sign for us to be able to move forward. Lionel, do you want to address just the projection accuracy very quickly so folks get a sense of the confidence level we have?
When we look at our projection accuracy year over year, it's about 1%. So the error is 1%. The accuracy is about 99%. When we look 10 years out, it gets, of course, tougher to project, particularly at the elementary school level, because, for example, those kids aren't born yet. So the projections in years 6 through 10, our process now, what we do is we do a rolling average of the previous 5 years, and we move that forward to estimate how many kindergartners we would have. But in terms of us having a solid number of, elementary kids that aren't born yet, we don't have the data. The best we can do is a rolling average. So with all due respect, I'm also interested in looking at the report and seeing where we differ in opinions. Also, last comment, last but not least, I don't know if you recall that chart, but Arlington does have a history of high enrollment. You remember in the chart in the 60s and the 70s, we were 25,000. We took that dive, and then in the 80s, we flattened out and we started to rise back. Well, what goes up must come down. And we don't know what is going to happen. We have some variables that we're looking at, but I don't anticipate we're going to have 5% growth over the next decade. We will know this September if last year's 5.2% growth was a blip, was it an outlier, or is it the start of a new trend? So this September 30th, it'll be interesting to see our growth rate this school year, to see what's going on and what direction we're going to take.
One thing that's really important to us, too, from a PTA perspective, and Mr. Tim Payne alluded to it in passing, and Mary, you also kind of said it, but you didn't really say it, is that a lot of this land purchase and land options are in North Arlington. It's a slightly different community down when we get to the geographic south part of the county. And so we're concerned about having the maintenance, the stick-to-itiveness of people who live down in the southern part of the county, and making the space available for them down there also. So that's something that, from a PTA perspective, we're very concerned about. It's not just a focus north, but also an inclusion in the south part.